My parents, who hadn't spoken to me in a decade, walked into my grandmother's while reading planning to take her lodge. They thought I was left with nothing, so I let the lawyer read the final letter she left only for me, ruining their plans completely. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The phone call from Mr. Harrison had felt like a phantom limb itching, a sensation from a part of my life I'd amputated a decade ago. My grandmother, Evelyn, was gone. The funeral was private, a word my parents, Martin and Cynthia, had clearly defined as Millie not included. I hadn't fought it. I mourned in my own way, in the quiet of the small apartment I'd furnished with restored antiques, surrounded by the blueprints and historical surveys that had become my real family. But Mr. Harrison had been insistent on the phone. "Evelyn was very specific, Millie. You must be at the reading of the will, please." So here I was, sitting on a stiff, leather-upholstered chair in a boardroom that smelled of old paper and furniture polish, feeling like a ghost. I was 29, but I felt 19 again, small, unwanted, and bracing for impact. I'd spent the last 10 years building a life from the ashes of the one my parents set on fire. I was Millie Thompson, a respected restoration consultant. I specialized in breathing life back into forgotten buildings, a skill I'd honed with bitter irony. I could fix anything but my own past. The door to the conference room opened, and the chill that entered had nothing to do with the weather. It was them. Martin and Cynthia. My father looked exactly as I remembered, only more severe. His suit was impossibly expensive, his silver-black hair perfectly coiffed. He was a man who didn't just enter a room, he appraised it for its value. My mother, Cynthia, glided in behind him, a whisper of designer perfume trailing her. Her face was a smooth, Botoxed mask of polite indifference. They were a match set, polished, cold, and entirely self-contained. They didn't see me at first. I was tucked in the corner, intentionally small. They were greeting Mr. Harrison, their voices the smooth, practiced baritones of people accustomed to getting their way. "Mr. Harrison, good to see you," Martin said, already pulling out a chair at the head of the table. "A sad day, of course. Mother was a force. We're hoping this can be concluded quickly. Cynthia and I have a flight to Aspen." "Of course, Martin," Mr. Harrison said, his face impassive. He was a kind man, Evelyn's oldest friend, and his eyes held a flicker of something I couldn't place. Sadness or perhaps pity. Then Cynthia turned. Her eyes scanned the room and landed on me. The polite mask didn't just slip, it shattered. Her lips thinned into a white line. "Millie," she said. The name was an accusation. Martin's head snapped toward me. His expression was one of profound irritation, as if a catering order had been delivered incorrectly. "What is she doing here?" he directed at Mr. Harrison. "Evelyn insisted," the lawyer said simply, gesturing for them to sit. "Insisted?" Cynthia scoffed, taking a seat as far from me as possible. "That's ridiculous. She has no claim here. We made that perfectly clear a decade ago." They turned their attention back to the lawyer, dismissing me as easily as they had at 19. I watched them, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. They weren't just ignoring me, they were erasing me, even in my grandmother's final moments. They started talking between themselves, their voices low but not low enough. "The lodge is going to need a complete gut job," Cynthia murmured, pulling a small notebook from her alligator skin bag. "The foundation is sound, but those rustic beams are simply depressing. I'm thinking clean lines, floor-to-ceiling glass." "The value is in the land, Cynthia," Martin replied, tapping his pen on the table. "We'll need to subdivide the back 40 acres. The access road will be an issue, but the permits should be simple enough once we have the title." "The Mountain Lodge," Cynthia said, a dreamy, avaricious look in her eye. "It sounds perfect for the new brand." I felt the blood drain from my face. They were talking about Evelyn's home, the only place I had ever felt safe. The sprawling, beautiful, admittedly rustic lodge in the mountains where I'd spent every summer. The place Evelyn had built with her own hands, filled with her books and her art and the smell of pine and wood smoke. And they were talking about it like it was a teardown. I gripped the arms of my chair, my knuckles white. The nausea that rose in my throat wasn't just grief, it was a white-hot, familiar rage. They hadn't changed. They were still the people who'd looked at their 19-year-old daughter, who just told them E was giving up the business degree they'd chosen for her to study pointless, historic architecture, and had given her an ultimatum: get in line or get out. When I chose out, they'd had my bags packed and on the curb by nightfall. 10 years, 10 years of silence. 10 years of building a career they'd called a dirty hands hobby. And here they were, carving up the last piece of my childhood before the will was even read. They hadn't just kicked me out, they had forgotten I existed. The betrayal was worse than the silence had ever been. The immediate aftermath of their entrance was a thick, suffocating silence, broken only by the rustle of Mr. Harrison's papers. I could feel their disdain radiating across the table. It was a physical pressure, a heavy blanket of contempt I'd spent my entire adult life learning to breathe under. My mother, Cynthia, deliberately angled her chair away from me, a physical snub that was as sharp as a slap. My father, Martin, was openly checking his watch, a heavy gold monstrosity that seemed to tick louder than my own frantic pulse. He was performing his impatience, letting the room know that this formality was beneath him. I focused on a watermark on the polished mahogany table, tracing its faint outline with my eyes. My hands were trembling, so I clasped them in my lap, digging my nails into my palms. Don't you dare cry, I told myself. Don't you give them the satisfaction. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. If we're all present, he began, his gaze pointedly including me, I will begin. As I said, Martin interrupted, we are on a schedule. We assume Mother left the bulk of her estate, namely, the lodge and the portfolio, to us, her only son. These things are usually straightforward. Evelyn was many things, Martin, Mr. Harrison said, his voice dry as old parchment. Straightforward was rarely one of them. Now, as executor, I must read the will in its entirety. He put on a pair of reading glasses and began to drone through the legal essay. The air in the room grew stale. I felt a migraine beginning to pulse behind my right eye, a familiar stress response. I risked a glance at my parents. Cynthia was sketching on her notepad, a window, I realized. She was redesigning the lodge right here, right now. Martin was texting, his thumb moving in an angry, rapid blur. They were so utterly, comfortably arrogant. They were here to collect a prize they believed was their birthright, and I was just a piece of unfortunate scenery. Mr. Harrison read through the smaller bequests first. A sum to her longtime gardener, a donation to the local library, a collection of first-edition poetry books to a university archive. With each item, Martin's posture grew stiffer, his tapping pen becoming more insistent. Yes, very generous, he finally cut in, unable to help himself. Can we move on to the real property? Mr. Harrison looked at him over the rim of his glasses. Martin, I have been your mother's lawyer for 40 years. I will conduct this reading as she instructed. Do not interrupt me again. My father's face flushed a dull, angry red. He wasn't used to being told no. He crossed his arms and subsided into a simmering, volcanic silence. I felt a small, cold kernel of something settle in my stomach. It wasn't hope. I'd learned better than to hope for anything from this family. It was something else. A flicker of curiosity. Evelyn had known her son. She had known her daughter-in-law, and she had known me, and she had insisted I be here. My grandmother had been a weaver, her fingers always busy with thread. She loved intricate patterns, puzzles, and the quiet satisfaction of a knot pulled tight. I looked at my parents, at their casual cruelty and their blatant, ugly greed. They were so busy planning their victory that they hadn't even considered the possibility of a different outcome. They were developers, accustomed to bulldozing whatever stood in their way. But Evelyn was a restorer just like me. She preserved things. She understood foundations. And as I sat there, a thought, sharp and clear, cut through my anxiety. They had forgotten one crucial thing. They had forgotten who Evelyn truly was. And they had forgotten that, while they were her blood, I was her legacy. The thought steadied my hand. The trembling stopped. I sat up straighter, unclasped my hands, and placed them firmly on the table. The room felt like a pressure cooker, and Mr. Harrison was methodically, maddeningly, turning up the heat. He continued with the will, detailing minor assets, a jewelry collection, a classic car, stock holdings. With each item bequeathed to a distant cousin or a charity, my father's jaw tightened. He wasn't just impatient, he was offended. This was his inheritance, and his mother was giving it away piece by piece. My mind drifted from the lawyer's voice to the memory of the woman he was describing. Evelyn, she wasn't just my grandma. She was my sanctuary. After my parents kicked me out, when I was living in a terrifyingly grim dorm room, sleeping on a mattress thin as a cracker, a check would arrive. Never from a bank account tied to her name. Always a cashier's check, tucked inside a book on architectural history or a biography of a female artist. The note would be simple: keep building, Millie. They can't tear down what's in your head. She was the one who had taught me to see the bones of a building, to respect the craftsmanship of the past, while my parents were pushing me toward corporate law or finance. Professions with prestige. As my mother would say, Evelyn was teaching me to mix plaster, identify wood rot, and read a blueprint. Your father, she told me once, stirring lemonade on the lodge's wide porch, only sees the price of things. He's forgotten how to see the value. Don't you ever make that mistake. Her sacrifices for me were quiet but profound. I knew she'd fought with my father about me. I'd overheard the phone calls. She's a child, Martin. You can't just throw her away. And his cold reply, she made her choice, Mother. She's not part of this family if she can't respect what we've built. What they'd built. My father, Martin, was a luxury developer. He bought historic properties, tore out their souls, as Evelyn called it, and installed sterile vistas of chrome and glass. He sold lifestyles to people with too much money and no taste. My mother, Cynthia, was his partner in this aesthetic crime. Her interior design consisted of finding the most expensive, uncomfortable white furniture possible and arranging it in rooms that felt more like hospital wards than homes. She was the one who had truly poisoned my father against me. I was a disappointment. A rebellious phase that was ruining their image. I remembered her expression when I'd come home one college break with sawdust on my jeans and a glow of pride, having just finished an internship restoring a 19th century library. Millie, darling, she'd said, her nose wrinkled in distaste. You smell of labor. We send you to a top-tier school to network with the children of CEOs, and you come back looking like a carpenter. What will people think? Her entire world was built on the fragile scaffold of what people think. She was polished, yes, but utterly disingenuous. Her smile was a weapon, and her compliments were always laced with a subtle venom. She viewed my passion as a personal affront, a messy, unmanageable stain on her perfect, beige-colored life. And now, Mr. Harrison's voice sliced through my memories, pulling me back to the present. We come to the primary assets. First, the investment portfolio. Martin sat bolt upright. Cynthia put down her pen. This was it. The entirety of the Thompson investment portfolio, valued at approximately $12 million, Mr. Harrison read. I leave, in its entirety, to be split equally between my son, Martin, and my daughter-in-law, Cynthia. My mother's sharp inhale was the only sound. A slow, reptilian smile spread across Martin's face. He'd won. He shot a look at me, a quick, triumphant sneer. See, this is how the world works. The adults get the prize, you get nothing. He reached across the table and squeezed Cynthia's hand. As it should be, he murmured, loud enough for me to hear. And finally, Mr. Harrison continued, we come to the matter of the mountain lodge, its surrounding land, and all its contents. Cynthia was already flipping to a new page in her notebook, her pen poised. Evelyn was very clear on this point, the lawyer said, his eyes finding mine across the table. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something, a warning, a prelude. The lodge, he read, a property I built with my late husband and a place of significant personal value, I bequeath. He paused. My father leaned forward, his whole body thrumming with anticipation. To be held in a temporary trust, managed by my executor, Mr. Harrison, to be disposed of in accordance with the instructions left in a final letter, to be opened and read after the conclusion of this will. The air went out of the room. "What?" Martin said, his voice flat. "What does that mean? A temporary trust? What letter?" "All in due time, Martin," Mr. Harrison said calmly. "The will is concluded, but Evelyn left 2 other items. First, a letter for you and Cynthia, and second, a letter for Millie." He slid 2 envelopes across the table. One was a standard, business-sized envelope addressed to Martin and Cynthia in Evelyn's elegant, spidery script. The other, the one he slid toward me, was a thick, heavy vellum envelope tied with a black ribbon and sealed with her personal wax stamp. It just had one word on it: Millie. The moment that heavy vellum envelope touched my fingers, a jolt went through me. It was warm, as if she had just handed it to me herself. I stared at her familiar, looping handwriting, the M of my name drawn with a confident flourish. Across the table, my father snatched their envelope. He ripped it open with an impatient, tearing sound that set my teeth on edge. I watched them as they read. My mother's perfectly plucked eyebrows drew together. My father's face, which had been smug and triumphant just moments before, began to darken. He read the short note, then read it again, his lips moving silently. "This is absurd," he finally spat, slamming the letter down on the table. "A waiting period? What is this nonsense?" Cynthia looked frantic. "She's instructing us to wait, for 90 days, before the trust is dissolved and the lodge title is transferred to us. Why?" "Evelyn's instructions are clear," Mr. Harrison said, his voice a calm counterpoint to their rising hysteria. "The trust holds the lodge for 90 days. After that period, it passes to you, provided," he added, "you have met the conditions." "Conditions?" Martin's voice was rising. "What conditions?" "They are personal," Mr. Harrison said, glancing at me. "I believe your mother was encouraging a period of reflection." Reflection? My parents hadn't reflected on a single thing in their entire lives. They only acted to acquire, to demolish, to possess. This was a trap. A classic Evelyn move. She hadn't just given them the lodge, she'd attached strings, and my parents were already puppets dancing on them. "This is a joke," Cynthia said, her voice high and thin. "She's playing games, even from the grave." "The will is ironclad, Cynthia," Mr. Harrison said. "Now that concludes our business." He stood up, a clear dismissal. My parents stood as well, but they were frozen, looking at each other in baffled rage. They hadn't gotten their clean, quick victory. They'd been given a delay. To them, a delay was a denial. They stalked out of the room without another word, without a single glance in my direction, leaving me alone with Mr. Harrison and the heavy letter in my hand. "Are you all right, Millie?" he asked gently, his professional mask softening. I don't know what this is," I whispered, holding up the envelope. "It's for you, my dear. She was very insistent it be given to you only after they had received theirs. She wanted them to be unsettled." He gave me a small, sad smile. "Evelyn knew her son. She knew his impatience. I suggest you read your letter in private. It contains significant details." I clutched the letter to my chest and fled. I didn't go home. I went to the only place that felt right, the city archives, the quiet, vaulted room where I did my best work. I sat at a heavy oak table, the smell of old paper and history surrounding me, and with trembling fingers, I untied the black ribbon. Inside wasn't just a letter, there was a key, a heavy, old-fashioned skeleton key, and a single, folded page. "My dearest Millie," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have had to sit in a room with your parents. For that, I am endlessly sorry, but I needed you there. I needed you to see them, and I needed them to see you. I have left them a puzzle. I have given them what they think they want, the lodge, but I have given them a 90-day wait and a condition they must fulfill, to honor the family's history. They will fail, Millie. They don't know how to do anything but tear things down. They will be so blinded by their greed and their irritation at the delay that they will miss what is right in front of them. They think they are inheriting a building. They have forgotten that the lodge is not just a structure, It is a testament, and they have forgotten what you do for a living. This key is for my private study at the lodge, the one I always kept locked. They do not have a key, they will not be able to enter. Inside that study, you will find everything. You are a restorer, my love. You know how to find the truth hidden beneath the surface. They think they are inheriting a property. You are inheriting the story. They have 90 days to prove they are worthy. They won't. They will prove the opposite. And when they fail, the lodge will need its true owner. Go to the lodge, use your skills, find what I've left for you. Your father and mother have forgotten one crucial thing. I know who they are, but more importantly, I know who you are. Keep building, your Evelyn. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely refold the letter. A clever trap. She built a trap for them, and she just handed me the key. They thought they were in a waiting period. I was in a race. I was no longer a victim in a boardroom. I was an investigator. I was a restorer. And I had a job to do. I looked at the heavy iron key in my palm. The clever trap wasn't just the will, it was my entire career. She'd been training me for this moment my entire life. The next day, I drove. I drove for 3 hours, up winding mountain roads, the air growing thinner and cleaner, smelling of pine and damp earth. The lodge. I hadn't been there in 10 years, not since the summer before the fight. My small car felt insignificant as I pulled up the long gravel driveway, the house looming into view. It was just as I remembered. A sprawling, beautiful giant of cedar and river stone, its wide porch overlooking a valley that fell away into mist. My parents' car was already there. A sleek, black, offensively modern SUV parked near the entrance. Of course, they couldn't even wait a day. They were already here, appraising, planning their demolition. I parked behind them, took a deep breath, and got out. I found them on the back deck with a third person, a man in a sharp suit holding a clipboard, a contractor. The entire wall has to go, Cynthia was saying, gesturing dramatically. Glass, all of it. We need to open up the view. This dark wood is suffocating. The load-bearing beams might be an issue, the contractor said, tapping a support column. Then replace them with steel, Martin snapped. Whatever it takes, we need this ready for market analysis in 90 days. They hadn't heard me approach. It's a post and beam construction, I said, my voice clear in the mountain air. All 3 of them spun around. My mother's hand flew to her chest. Millie, you startled me. What on earth are you doing here? This isn't your property, my father said, his face hardening into the familiar mask of anger. You heard the will. This is ours. It's in trust, actually, I said, walking past them toward the main door. For 90 days, and grandmother asked me to check on a few things. There's nothing for you here, Cynthia said, following me. This is a private matter. We're consulting with our designer. You mean your contractor? I asked, looking at the man, who now seemed deeply uncomfortable. You're planning renovations, then, already? We're preparing, Martin said, crossing his arms. It's what sensible people do. We're honoring her memory by improving the property, increasing its value. Honoring her memory, I repeated, the words tasting like ash. By tearing out the beams she and Grandpa put in by hand, by replacing her library with a wall of glass. It's called modernization, Millie, Cynthia said, her voice dripping with condescension. Something you, with your hobby, wouldn't understand. This isn't a museum, it's an asset. You're right, I said, stopping in front of a heavy, carved wooden door just off the main hall. It's not a museum, it's a testament. What are you doing? Martin demanded as I reached into my pocket. That's Mother's study. It's been locked for years. I know, I said. I produced the heavy iron key. The color drained from my father's face. My mother's eyes widened, her gaze fixed on the key in my hand. Where, Martin said, his voice dangerously low, did you get that? She left it for me, I said, sliding the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying clunk. She left me a letter, too. Did you get a letter? The look of pure, unadulterated shock on their faces was better than any inheritance. I had revealed the first piece of information, the first crack in their perfect, arrogant facade. I had something they didn't. I had a key. What letter? Cynthia stammered. What did it say? It said, I said, pushing the door open into the dark, dusty room, that she knew you'd be here. And she knew you'd bring a contractor. I stepped inside. They stood in the hallway, frozen. They were furious, but more than that, they were afraid. For the first time in their lives, they were not in control. I had a key to a room they couldn't enter, and it was clear from my face that I knew something they didn't. Their simple, 90-day wait had just become a nightmare. Their poorly executed threat was their own assumption. They had assumed I was nothing, that I had been left with nothing. You have no right, Martin finally bellowed. I have a key, I said, turning to look at them from the darkness of the study. Grandmother gave it to me. That's more right than you've ever had. I shut the door in their stunned, furious faces. I locked the door from the inside. My heart was hammering, but my hands were steady. The study was exactly as I remembered it from my childhood, only shrouded in dust. It smelled of old books, her perfume, and dry pine. This was her sanctuary. Sunbeams, thick with motes of dust, cut through the gloom from the shuttered windows. And on the massive oak desk in the center of the room, there was a stack of ledgers and a small, wooden box. I spent the next 2 days in that room. I slept on the small cot in the corner just as I had during childhood sleepovers. Outside, I could hear my parents. They paced, they argued. They made furious, loud phone calls to Mr. Harrison, who, I assumed, calmly told them the same thing. The trust is in place. Millie has a right to be there. They even had the contractor jiggle the handle, but the old lock held firm. They were desperate, and their desperation was making them sloppy. The ledgers were not just household accounts. Evelyn had been meticulous. She had documented everything. Every check she'd sent me for tuition. Every receipt for the business loans she'd given my father over the years, loans he'd apparently never paid back. But the real treasure was in the wooden box. Inside was a thick sheaf of papers, bound in ribbon. It was a formal report. A historic structure report for the Mountain Lodge, compiled by a professional firm. It was dated just 6 months ago. My grandmother, knowing her health was failing, had commissioned a full-scale analysis of her home. Attached to it was another document, an application, filled out but not yet filed, for the lodge to be placed on the National Register of Historic Places. My breath caught. This was the clever trap. The application detailed, in painstaking academic language, the lodge's unique architectural significance, its irreplaceable post and beam joinery, and its cultural importance to the region. If this was filed and approved, the lodge would be protected. It could never be gutted. The wall of glass and steel beams my parents wanted would be illegal. Any alteration would have to go through a rigorous, expensive approval process, a process I, as a restoration consultant, knew exactly how to navigate, and a process they, as developers, would find impossible. Evelyn hadn't just left me a key, she had left me a nuclear weapon. I found the final piece at the bottom of the box, a personal letter from Evelyn to Mr. Harrison. In the event of my death, it read, give Martin and Cynthia their 90 days. Let them show their hand. If they attempt any alteration, any demolition, or bring a single contractor to my home with the intent to destroy, you are to file this application immediately, and you are to give the second copy to Millie. She will know what to do. A second, identical application was beneath the letter. My copy. I spent the next week building my case. I left the lodge and drove back to the city. I didn't just read the report, I memorized it. I cross-referenced it with my own professional knowledge, adding my own notes, preparing my own expert testimony. I contacted the State Historic Preservation Office to understand their current backlog and filing requirements. I was no longer just a granddaughter. I was a professional preparing for a legal battle. The second confrontation happened at the lodge a week later. I'd arranged to meet Mr. Harrison there. My parents, having been informed of the meeting, were waiting on the porch, their faces like thunder. This has gone on long enough, Martin snarled as I walked up. We've had our lawyers review the will. This waiting period is tenuous. We are the beneficiaries. You are, Mr. Harrison agreed, stepping out of his car, holding his briefcase. But you haven't met the conditions. What conditions? Cynthia cried, her voice cracking. The letter was vague. Honor the family's history. What does that even mean? We're here. We're planning to make the property better. I believe, I said, stepping forward, that this is what she meant. I held up the bound historic structure report. My father looked at it confused. What is that? A book? It's an inventory, I said, my voice cold and precise. It's a complete report on the historic and architectural significance of this lodge. A report your mother commissioned 6 months ago. The one, I added, that forms the basis of this. I held up the second document, the application for the National Register. My mother, Cynthia, the interior designer, understood first. Her face went bone white. She literally stumbled back a step. No, she wouldn't. My father, the developer, was a moment behind. He snatched the application from my hand. He read the title, his eyes scanning the first page. The color drained from his face, replaced by a dark, apoplectic purple. You did this. This is your doing, you ungrateful. I did nothing, I said, my voice ringing out in the clear air. She did. She knew you. She knew you'd bring contractors. She knew you'd see this place as a pile of lumber and a plot of land, not as a home. She knew you'd fail her test. This is a trick, he stammered, waving the paper. It's not filed, it means nothing. It's not filed yet, Mr. Harrison said calmly. Evelyn's instructions to me were clear. If you demonstrated intent to destroy the property's historical integrity, which you did, Martin, within 24 hours, I was to file. The only reason I haven't, he said, is because she left one final instruction. He looked at me. The spell was broken. My father was no longer the terrifying giant of my childhood. He was just a greedy, cornered man. My mother was crying, not from grief, but from rage. What instruction? Martin whispered. She gave the final choice, Mr. Harrison said, to Millie. The final showdown wasn't in a boardroom. It was on the wide, sweeping porch of the lodge, the place where Evelyn had taught me to paint, to read, and to be strong. It was 91 days after the will reading. The waiting period was over. Mr. Harrison had called the final meeting. My parents were already there when I arrived. They looked diminished. The last 3 months had not been kind to them. Their arrogance had curdled into a brittle, defensive anger. They had hired their own lawyers, who had, I knew, told them what Mr. Harrison had already made clear. The trust was valid, and the historic designation was a silver bullet. If I filed that application, their Mountain Lodge development brand was dead on arrival. The property would be locked in regulatory hell for years, and its value to them, as a teardown, would plummet to zero. They were sitting stiffly in the porch rockers. They looked at me as I walked up, their expressions a toxic mix of hatred and, for the first time in my life, a desperate, fumbling need. Millie, my father, Martin, began. He was attempting a smile, but it looked more like a grimace. It was the negotiation smile he used on zoning boards. We're glad you're here. We think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. No, I said, remaining standing. I think, for the first time, there's been perfect understanding. Mr. Harrison placed his briefcase on the porch table. The trust officially expires today. The lodge and its contents must now pass to a beneficiary. As per Evelyn's final instructions, we are here to determine who that is. Martin and Cynthia, or Millie. Us, Cynthia burst out, jumping to her feet. The will said us, this is coercion. She's using this historical nonsense to blackmail us. Is that what you call your mother's legacy? I asked, my voice quiet. Nonsense. This, Martin said, standing up to join his wife, his voice adopting a paternal, lecturing tone, is about assets, Millie. It's about a multi-million-dollar property. You, with your little restoration hobby, you can't afford this place. The taxes alone would bankrupt you in a year. Be sensible. We'll give you a percentage. A finder's fee for your help. The insult was so profound, so deeply ingrained in his character, that I almost laughed. He was still trying to buy me off. He still saw me as the 19-year-old girl to be managed with a threat or a check. I'm not here to negotiate, Dad, I said. The word dad felt foreign and strange on my tongue. I'm here to make a choice. Grandmother gave me the choice. Then choose, he yelled, his facade cracking. Choose us, your family, we can put this all behind us. Your mother and I, we're willing to forgive you. Forgive me? I asked. The calm I had felt for 3 months finally broke, replaced by a cold, righteous fire. Forgive me for what? For building a life? For succeeding in the career you called a dirty hobby? A career, by the way, that makes me the only person in this family qualified to save this house, not destroy it. You kicked me out. You didn't speak to me for 10 years. You walked into that while reading and planned to bulldoze the only home I ever had. And you want me to forgive you. They stared at me, speechless. I'm not filing the application, I said. A wave of visible, dizzying relief washed over my parents. Cynthia sat down hard. Martin's shoulders sagged. He'd won. He'd won. Ah, he said, clearing his throat, trying to recapture his dignity. Well, good, you made the right choice, Millie, the sensible. I'm not filing the application, I repeated, because I don't need to, Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison opened his briefcase. He pulled out a single, folded letter. It was the one I'd found in the study. The second one, the one I hadn't read aloud. Evelyn's final letter, Mr. Harrison announced to the porch. To be read today at the conclusion of the 90 days. To my executor, it reads. By now, my son Martin and his wife Cynthia will have shown their true colors. They will have proven unequivocally that they do not value this family's history. They value only its price tag. Their condition to inherit was to honor the past. By bringing in contractors, by planning to gut my home, they have failed this test in every conceivable way. Therefore, the clause bequeathing them the lodge is null and void. The 90-day trust is dissolved. I leave the mountain lodge, its contents, and the entirety of its land, free and clear, to the only person who ever understood its value, my granddaughter, Millie Thompson. The silence on the porch was absolute. It was so quiet I could hear a hawk screeching, far down in the valley. My mother made a small, choking sound. My father's face was a mask of utter, white-hot disbelief. He looked from me to Mr. Harrison and back again. What? No, the will said. The will, I said, my voice shaking but strong, left them a puzzle. A test, and you failed. My father took a step toward me, his hand raised. I didn't flinch. I just looked at him. The man who had thrown me out. The man who had ignored me. The man who was, in this moment, completely and totally defeated. You little bitch, he whispered, his voice hoarse. You planned this. You trapped us. She did, I said, gesturing to the sky. She trapped you, she knew you, and she left her house to me. My mother finally broke. She let out a long, keening wail of pure, frustrated greed. It was the ugliest sound I had ever heard. Martin just stared, his empire of glass and steel crumbling around him. He had been outmaneuvered, outplanned, and outclassed by 2 women, one dead and one he had thrown away. I had my realization. I didn't just have the lodge, I had all of it. The betrayal was finally, completely over. I was free. The downfall was swift and silent. My father, Martin, did not go quietly. He threatened to sue to contest the will, to sue Mr. Harrison for malpractice, to sue me for, I wasn't even sure what, but his bluster was just air leaving a balloon. Mr. Harrison calmly presented him with the other documents from Evelyn's study. The stack of loans he'd never repaid, with interest, which the estate, now my estate, would be happy to collect, or to forgive if he and Cynthia signed a waiver accepting the will as final. They signed. Their $12 million inheritance was suddenly cut in half by their decade-old debts to their mother. They left the lodge that day, and I am told took their flight to Aspen. They had their money, but they had lost the prize. They had lost the one thing they couldn't stand to lose, a status symbol, a victory. The public humiliation of being outsmarted by their estranged daughter, the carpenter, was, I knew, a far worse punishment than the financial loss. The weeks that followed were quiet. I moved into the lodge. I walked through the rooms, not as a guest, but as its protector. I opened the shutters in her study, letting the light flood in. I sat at her desk, my fingers tracing the grain of the wood. It felt like coming home. Mr. Harrison stopped by one afternoon, a few months later. "Just checking on the new owner," he said, smiling, accepting the cup of tea I offered. We sat on the porch, in the same rockers where my parents had faced their defeat. "She would be so proud of you, Millie," he said quietly. "She worried, that she was putting too much on you." "She was training me," I said, looking out at the valley. "All those summers, she wasn't just teaching me to fix buildings. She was teaching me to be strong, to see the value in things others discard." "Indeed," he took a sip of tea. "Your father, he and Cynthia have put their city home on the market. I hear they're downsizing, considerably. The brand they were building seems to have stalled." I felt a small, sad pang, but it wasn't grief. It was closure. They had built their life on a foundation of greed, and it was as unstable as they'd always claimed the Lodge S was. I used my own professional network not for revenge, but for restoration. I officially filed the application for the National Register of Historic Places. It was approved in record time. The Lodge was safe forever. I began the long, loving process of restoring it, not as a sterile museum, but as a living, breathing home. My firm's new headquarters, a place for retreats, a place where history was the main selling point. One evening, about a year later, I was sorting through the last of Evelyn's books in the study. Tucked inside a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice was a final, small note, one I'd missed. It wasn't in an envelope. It was just a scrap of paper. "Millie, they will tell you that you can't live in the past. But they're wrong. You just have to know what's worth saving. You are, this house is, I love you. E." I sank onto the cot, the note clutched in my hand, and for the first time since it all began, I cried. Not for the betrayal or the anger or the fight. I cried from the sheer, overwhelming weight of being truly, completely loved. My parents had tried to erase me, but my grandmother had made me an heir. She hadn't just left me a house. She had left me a foundation, and I would spend the rest of my life building on it.